there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's 2016 in a Pennsylvania courtroom, and Jamie Silverneck has just pled guilty to the first-degree murder of her mother. She was only 14 when her mum was stabbed to death last year by her 20-year-old boyfriend, killed because she didn't approve of their relationship. "She needs to go, Caleb," she'd texted. "I want her gone." What came next has been described as vicious and monstrous. Cheryl died from stab wounds to the neck inside her vehicle after she'd driven the couple to a concert. They buried her body in the dirt and snow. Jamie is being tried in an adult court, not a juvenile one, with the judge citing her intelligence and manipulation as reasons. She's given 35 years to life, ordered to serve her time inside CSI Muncie, a maximum security prison home to 1,400 female inmates, including 170 lifers and 3 on death row. So how has she fared after nearly a decade behind bars, once the headlines of her crime were gobbled up by the next big murder? This is the story of women incarcerated, what life is actually like for women locked up for murder. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Men dominate criminality, and that's particularly so when it comes to murder, with women responsible for around 10% of the total homicides across Australia, Canada, England, and the US. Because it's such a small pool, not much study has been done into it. But today's guest, Dr. Kathryn M. Whiteley, set out to change that more than 20 years ago. Kathryn is a feminist criminologist who started her research down under before moving to America, where she currently still resides. Over the past 2 decades, she's become an expert on female violent offenders and worked in and around maximum security prisons around the world. In particular, she's interested in giving these women a voice, in hearing their stories from their own mouths. She's shared some of the many conversations she's had over the years on her podcast, Self-Identities, Conversations with Convicted Women, alongside her co-host, AJ Nutter. Kathryn joins us now. Kathryn, you're an Aussie, but you now live in America, in and around incarcerated women. How did you find yourself there?
Okay, so going back about 18 years ago, I applied for a position in the United States as a visiting professor at one of the universities there. And the reason I wanted to do that was because the incarcerated women in the cohort that I work with that have committed violent crimes, it was a smaller number here. And I thought, well, why not reach out and look for a position in the United States that would allow to open up doors for me to further, I think, the scholarship and further the education regarding incarcerated women who violently offend. And what better place, unfortunately, than to go to the United States. So it really was through my work as an academic, but it has evolved into much more than that now. It's a calling for me, however you wish to frame that or what that word means to many people, but it's a priority in my life now. And I travel around the United States and into various women's maximum security prisons and even overseas and to Ireland as well, in order to just help women in this cohort, the women that we seem to abandon, help them have a voice, a platform for them to have a voice. But that's how it started. I had no idea growing up in Queensland in a little town called Dalby that one day I would be living in the United States and working with women in this cohort to a large capacity.
It's interesting you say that, because looking at the stats on female murderers and the statistics that you can pull in Australia, you know, your research itself showed largely ethnic minorities, young women in that kind of 20 to 24 age bracket is where the majority of these murders are happening, subject to socioeconomic handicaps, often single mums, often substance abuse, mental health, history of sexual abuse. So that's the top line. But you're saying that that is just the top line.
That is just the top line. I'm really glad you pointed that out, because I am now seeing, the longer I have been, and I'm talking about specifically here now, the United States, I am interacting and engaging with women. They're in their mid to late 30s, in their 40s, and it's the first crime that they have committed. So these women have lived some of their life. It's almost like I've moved just beyond the information you've provided, that there are older women now, and particularly, and I want to share this, in the United States, older women entering the prison system. And often it is a first-time crime. They don't have any history. I've met young women at the age of 14 and a 16-year-old that's committed murder. I've met a woman that was in her late 60s and early 70s that has committed a murder. So how does our criminal justice system work with the different demographics, the socioeconomics? So I've been very blessed and very privy. It's an eye-opener for me, but it's a huge learning curve for me about not boxing in women that commit violent crimes, and specifically murder.
Can you talk to me about motive? Because I think that is the biggest question mark, and how it compares to the other gender, male versus female motives. Are they very different?
They are different. I mean, we could say that a male will commit a violent crime for jealousy or financial. Well, so will a woman. We understand that. But often with women, you have to reflect, go back to their pathway, go back to their youth, their life prior to committing the crime. And you'll often find that it is, shall we say, there's a large percentage of victimisation. Now, that's a very broad term. But often you will hear or you'll uncover information about women that were victimised from neglect, abuse, sexual, emotional, physical abuse, etc. The ACEs, which as we know is the adverse childhood experiences, and that particular, shall we say, number or rate is usually very high. So the higher it is, shares the more explicit that the women have suffered, or as young girls or later in life, to victimisation or abuse and trauma. But with the males, you don't seem to hear too much about that. We've got a lot more to learn in that realm, but with the women, that's what I'm finding, that there are more specific times in their life that there was this struggle, this abuse, this trauma from usually someone either close to them, more rarely from the outside, but more internally someone close to them.
A stat I did find interesting is that even though women account for only, about 10% of murders in Western society, they are responsible for around half of child homicides.
Yes.
Is that something you've explored and tried to understand?
I have. I would say 60% of the women, and I'm going to say in the United States.
Yep.
That is my mass cohort. 60% of the women that I work with have murdered child. So we're looking at
60%?
60% of the women that I directly have worked with. So we're looking at neonaticide. We have infanticide, which oversees neonaticide and infanticide. Most of that 60% have killed infants as opposed to, 1-2-year-olds, etc. But no, I do. I work closely. When I say work closely, I research this group, and I also include them in my other media platforms.
I think parents will want to understand why. Are there factors that lead to it?
So if you're looking at a woman that may murder her baby, a young woman, often young women will murder their newborn. And we could say the 18 to 25-year-olds, very much neonaticide, the first 12 months. Then you've got infanticide, and you'll find it usually the woman, and I'm generalising here because, research is fluid, you know what I mean? So, but if we take the step further to a woman that will kill an infant or a toddler, you're often looking at the older, the 25 to the 35-year age group there. And then overall the, filicide, then you're looking at possibly a woman. It could be a stepchild. It could be, one of their own biological children as well. So, it's interesting. The neonaticide is very much skewed towards women that are very young or younger. Sometimes it's a bit to do with they're pregnant at 15, 16, 17, scared fear, or it's against our belief system, what's going to happen to me, or it could be that they have been raped and they don't, wish, to mother the child. And they're young. That's just it. They're a younger cohort for the neonaticide. But as I said, the infanticide, it's an young but older cohort. And infanticide, again, that's killing your child. So that can be a teenager that you kill as a mother.
How have you found the systems in Australia differ to those in America when it comes to incarceration, sentences, rehabilitation, and just the general jail experiences of women?
In the United States, we have a county jail, which you will spend time there for up to 2 years. And that's a bit like our, here in Australia, the remand, perspective. So you'll be sitting there, a woman will be sitting there up to 2 years. And usually after that, once she's committed a violent crime, of course, she's sitting there. But after that, you'll find she will be sentenced to go to upstate, is which what they refer to in America as a state prison. Now, I work with women closely in Pennsylvania, and there are two women's state prisons there. The one that I attend mostly there's about 1,500 women incarcerated there, and a couple hundred of those are women that I interact with that are serving life and life without parole. So when you talk about sentencing, very different, because a woman that could kill her child, it could be first or second degree, she will possibly receive a life sentence, which will be the 30, 35 years plus, again, before any chance of parole.
Which is a lot higher than here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And remember, we have life without parole, and that means never to be released. So there are women that have killed the children that I work with that they are serving life without parole. You know, we have life without parole here, I believe, in Australia, but it's very rare. But in the United States, there are a lot of young and older women that are serving life without parole for such things as filicide, and which includes infanticide and neonaticide.
Do you think that, and you might not want to answer this, but is it a fairer system, locking someone away for life?
I can bring in a bit of the professional, research experience there, but there are women that, the 10, the 15 years, and understanding their background and understanding behind the scenes the criminality, I would honestly say that they should not be serving a life or life without parole. There are a few women that are serving a life sentence, which will mean, as I said, a very lengthy sentence, and it doesn't guarantee you're going to get parole. And I just want to clarify that.
You have to apply for it.
That's right. You still have to apply, but it doesn't guarantee it. There are a smaller group that you're like, I don't know what it would feel like if I had lost children, if that woman that had killed my children, how would I feel? So, and I don't condone violence. I always like to make that disclaimer. And I haven't walked in any of their shoes. But from an outside observation, it does vary, and case by case, it really does. There are women in the United States, if you were to parallel the criminality or the crime compared to in Australia, the women in the United States well and truly would have been released by now. It's a huge difference, but I don't like to say one system is better than the other. But I do know we do have we do have a more punitive criminal justice system.
There are, and it's just fact, there are more men than women in prison. Does that play a part in the facilities, the opportunities?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm just diving in there. It does. And excuse me, I get so passionate about this and there's so much to share. It certainly does. But I have to say, and again, I'm looking at the United States, we're starting to be more focused on gender responsive programming, meaning that we'll focus more on the female or the woman as opposed to what's been like a cookie cutter over the years. For many, many decades, it's always whatever we provided, say for the male violent offenders, it was almost like a template in the women's, prisons. Yeah. No, we have moved beyond that. And again, speaking from the United States perspective, we still have a long way to go, but the women will share that there is improvement. I can't say it's not perfect, but there is an awareness, and we are trying very hard in the United States to improve and make sure that the women have ample opportunity to include lifers and long-termers that can receive and study for, a higher education they call it cosmetology, hairdressing in the United States, certificates in that, rather than the old trades like some of the men do, or many of the men in the state prisons do. Some of the women love trades too. They get up there on a ladder and they love all that. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here, and it's often family. And one of the biggest things I found is the neglect, is that the women, and we're going to compare a little bit about males here, but the women, the babies, the mums, the daughters, in visitation, everywhere.
Oh, wow, I hadn't even thought of that, but that makes so much sense.
See, and this is when we talk about, well, what are the women feeling inside? Neglect or abandonment.
So you're saying their husbands and their support systems stop turning up, like they just stop putting in the effort?
Eventually. So if you were to compare and contrast when I go into a female prison, again, I say a state prison, there's usually a couple of thousand women there, but it is just amazing. It's a mass of women, females there, and babies and children and youth there. And I'm not opposed, and I always have to be wary about this, that men do visit. There are men that love their women to the end. But it's such a contrast.
And it is interesting because I think that says a lot about, annoyingly, the societal tropes that exist in our world, the mental load that women take on and all of that kind of stuff. It doesn't surprise me that the women are the ones pushing visitation in men's prisons and the opposite isn't happening.
Absolutely. And again, there are men that are just amazing and are there to the very
There's
end.
always going to be exceptions.
Oh, there are. And, I've engaged with so many. But it's just one of those things. When someone said to me, what do you take from what you do? I said, the observation, the art of observing.
I've seen you say that you don't seek personal background or offending history prior to meeting with women for the first time. Why do you do that?
I think for me, it's been like, this will set me up, judgment. It'll set me up to say, well, not set me up, that's not the term, but I feel it's just like anyone. You read the information first, and then I'm to go in and ask the woman, and it skews the conversation. That's what I always find. It skews where, I've read about you, I'm going to focus on this area, where I love to give the women ownership, or we call it as agency, that I'll have some questions, but then they will own the conversation. And it's just, I just don't want to be skewed. I just don't want to narrow the conversation with what's best or suits me at the time.
I'm sure you then do go and eventually find out what they did.
Oh, absolutely.
Have you ever been shocked?
Well, I tell you, Marjorie Deal Armstrong, there was the pizza bomber. It's out there on Netflix, been around for a few years. And she had sent a letter, and she was in Pennsylvania at the time, and she'd heard about me inside, and she said, visiting, she said, hi, I'm Marjorie, and I'd like you to come visit. And I said, okay, this is great. So I had heard, I will share with listeners, I did ask my husband a little bit about this woman because she does write a big letter, and she went on and on. Anyway, so I learned a little bit about her before I drove up to visit her for the first time. But I'm sitting in this, this room of, a few hundred people, and she comes down the steps, which they do, and sits beside me. And of course, she can't touch or feel. And, we had pleasantries, and she had a very loud voice, and she's sitting there. And during our very first conversation, she started to talk about disagreeing and arguing that she was charged, or she shouldn't have been charged for this current crime. But then within the hour and a half, she's telling me she'd already killed 2 men before that.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, this is great, Marjorie. Okay. And I'm like, so I can see in the look on your face, it's like, I wasn't saying this is great, Marjorie, but I'm thinking to myself, okay, what have I just walked into? And you know what? I've written her story. I would not take back any of the hours and the days and the times I met with her. But that was my very first visit, and that was as a visitor, because I thought I'll go up and I'll spend some time. And she reached out to me because I do a lot of volunteer work. Yeah, that's my volunteer piece. And so she told me by the end of our conversation that she'd actually had killed 2 other men previously.
Multiple people.
Yes.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with criminologist and co-host of the Self-Identities podcast, Dr. Kathryn M. Whiteley. After the break, Kathryn describes how it feels going into the maximum security prisons and if she ever feels scared. Do you ever feel scared or uneasy in these conversations? Because they're convicted murderers. They've murdered people.
Yes, they have. No. I may have had one time, that was here in Australia, when I was very green and going in for the first time to interview the women for my research, for my PhD in the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre. There was one woman that I'd met the first time, and she brought a little bag with her. And I'm embarrassed to say this, and I've said this to others, but I'm embarrassed, but I'll share with you. And she had a little paper bag with her, and there was just her and myself in this room, a very small room, and she bent down to get something out of the bag. For one split second, I thought it was so silly and embarrassing. I thought, she got a knife or something in there. You know what I mean? And that was wrong. But after that, it was like, and immersing myself with these women, when I talk to them, I'm not looking at the crime. I'm wanting to know more and more about this woman sitting opposite me. So I would say that was just that one immature moment of my, is she going to do something? Is she going to pull out of the bag because I couldn't see? But because I go into many maximum security prisons, particularly in the United States, you do have to have your wits about you. And I don't mean for the women you're about to meet. I mean for the environment. You should never be comfortable with it, but you do attune yourself to what's around you. You don't just walk in there and think, hi, I'm here and no one's going to touch, hurt or harass. My problem is sometimes I get lost in where I am. And
in the prison?
Yeah, I forget where I am, literally, because it comes from years of experience and just feeling comfortable. I'm not going to say I feel comfortable in a women's maximum security prison, but I feel okay. I feel protected. I feel okay.
What about in a men's prison? For a comparison, do you feel scared and uneasy there?
Well, that is yes. I won't research in male prisons because I don't research men, but I often take criminology, criminal justice students into the men's maximum security prisons, again in Pennsylvania. And there's one of the main classification centres, it's called SEI Camp Hill. I've taken groups of students into that, and there's a few thousand men there, and they do walk around. They're in what we call general population. And I have students that almost cringe and, but that would possibly be the time that I'm always well and truly have my wits about me, because it's not an environment I'm familiar with. But I've been doing this for so long now. It's like, well, what prison am I going to next? You know what I mean? And I shouldn't be smiling or laughing, but I do have a wonderful time engaging with the women. Yeah.
I want to talk about some of their stories, but firstly, tell me about SCI Muncie. It's the prison you've spent, this large chunk of time in talking to women. What's it like there? How strict is it?
Well, it is, from the outside, it looks like an old college campus. In the hills, in the mountains. So when you're driving up, you see this very old cement brick building in the middle, and it's surrounded by walkways and greenery. And then if it didn't have the barbed wire fence, you possibly think, well, that looks a bit like a school or an older college, a smaller, older college from an American perspective. When you arrive there, and of course you're going through the gate and different things like this, it has a feel, and they have purposely worked towards making it feel comfortable for many of the women.
Really?
So you've got women walking around, you've got some women that are doing trade and doing gardening on the outside of the perimeters. But it isn't an isolated area, in a rural area there. You have so many different buildings. I do want to share a bit of a comparison compared to years ago when I was at the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre in Melbourne. The women there showed me their little houses and their huts. That is very much the Australian, shall we say, environment, where in the United States, it's still more the buildings and the cells.
Right.
And even at SCI Muncie, with 15, anywhere between 1,400, 1,500 women. You've got some old buildings, some new buildings. The grounds are immaculate, but they don't have, like when I went to, many years ago into the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre, I'm like, wow, these little homes are really women's little homes. They have their lounge, their kitchen, their bedrooms. But in SCI Muncie, they don't have that as such.
It's more traditional what you'd see on TV,
It is.
A cell, the bars, maybe a cellmate?
Well, it is traditional, and I don't want to sort of say it's cells, bars, and there's, it's all doom and gloom. But you are right. They have facilities that are just the one or two women to a cell. Traditional, absolutely. But they also have newer buildings too, some newer buildings that they're trying to cater for more women and more engagement. So, yeah, it is. It's a bit like traditional versus what we have here to some degree in the Australian system.
I want to talk about Marilyn. She was 19 when she was arrested for murder. She's been in prison for more than 50 years.
Correct.
And she's now in her 70s.
Yes.
Can we start with what she did? What was she sentenced for?
Marilyn and a male co-accomplice committed murder. They killed at close range 2 young law enforcement officers. So they killed, and the death penalty originally.
Really?
If you kill a law enforcement officer. So they were on the run. They had stolen goods. They had gone from Pennsylvania to interstate, and when apprehended by state troopers, Maryland shot at close range a law enforcement officer. It's a tough one because I'm going to say this, these young law enforcement officers had a child or children and they didn't go home. Yes, it's a first-degree murder if you kill, shoot a law enforcement officer.
So she's grown up behind bars. She's spent her entire adult life in prison. What's that been like?
What is it, the age of 5? She was raped and continued all the way to 15. She was sexually abused and her mother was violent towards her as well. So when you think about that environment, we always talk about the pathway to criminality, which is what I try to do with the women. So 15, then she became pregnant, and then her parents said, well, you're either going to give the child up, illegally, abort the child, or marry the person. So she married a particular gentleman, had a beautiful baby girl. That fell through. She became involved with this man that was a co-accomplice. So she went into the prison system at 19. Now, they did seek the death penalty, but then that was appealed and dropped, and she's now serving life without parole. And yes, she has been there for 52 years. I think she is one of the longest, definitely in Pennsylvania, one of the longest serving women there. Her life, it's very interesting when you listen to her talk. What she basically said is that prison, a state correctional facility, gave her a new life, gave her life in general. She's not being abused, you know what I mean? There's always trauma and there's always things happening, but she is like, you could say one of the older, or the old brigade now. She is an artist, incredible artist. She immerses herself into the prison culture. In other words, she's been a mentor. She has worked on the puppy program, which is part of the rehabilitative programs there. But literally, and it's ironic to say this, prison saved her life. It gave her back a life. Because when you think about it, rape, molestation, abuse, growing up and not having anyone to acknowledge that, because they were literally the abusers, going into prison, she started her life all over again. But 52 years, she will never be released. She's going to die there.
Does she want to be released?
We only touch on that. If she was released, and I don't want to put words into her mouth, she would find it rather challenging to navigate the real world.
Especially in her 70s now.
Absolutely. Now, her husband passed away recently, and I don't know how that would impact, if she still wishes to be released. But overall, I'm not going to say she's contented because I don't want to speak on her behalf. But this is all that she knows. But she deals with, what I love about her is that she deals every day with making sure she does the best she can while she has time on this earth.
But even that, you just slipped in her husband. So she's been married behind bars.
Yes, she has been married, and that happened after she was incarcerated. So, yeah, she's been married behind bars. There are women that pen pal, they'll meet someone and next minute, sometimes you know that they're married or they're getting married or something like that. It does happen. And
I have to ask, but can they consummate that marriage?
No.
Is that something they're allowed to do?
Not whilst they're, no.
But they do have these lives on the outside that they can form.
They certainly do. And I will share that I know women that men have reached out to them, and I've heard women literally discuss that, it's good because while I have this person in my life, they pay into my bank account. That affords me to buy something at commissary. So there are some women, and I want to say that there are some women that, mistreat the males because it's more like, a cash cow, shall we say. But most of the women I work with, as I said, this smaller cohort, every day to get up is a gift for them. And Marilyn's no different, but she has remorse. She does regret, I have to say, what she did all those years ago.
Is that common? You've spoken to hundreds of women. Do a lot of them show any remorse? Do they own up to what they did?
Okay, this is interesting. From case by case, a majority, and I don't want to put percentages out there, but I'd say 70% of the women in our conversations, either through my research or through the podcast or the documentary, remorse is expressed, absolutely. But then someone could easily say, well, they're remorseful because they got caught. And that could be a piece of that, but most of all, I'm going to say that most of the women, because they're serving long sentences, and many of the women that I talk to have been in there, 20, 30, 40 years, even though there's some that have only been in there 10 years and they're going to serve a long sentence. Most of those women, they do reflect incarceration and serving life or life without parole. It does give them time to reflect. It does, and they will share that I've changed. I look back to what I did, and it's not about if I could have time all over again. I do believe a larger percentage of the women serving life and life without parole, when they express remorse, they are serious about that.
Up next, Kathryn shares the story of Terry, who was incarcerated in her early 20s, as well as the most shocking story she's encountered in her work. So Terry was the first woman you met when you went inside SCI Muncie.
Correct.
What's her story? She was also arrested very young, 22.
Yes. Terry is an African-American lady and converted to Muslim since she's been inside. And I can share a bit about her life there. So Terry was young. She was a Philadelphia police officer, very new at the job. She became involved with a man that was involved with drugs. So literally her and her co-accomplice went to an apartment, to some, another man's home, and it was to be about drugs and money. The male that they went to visit was shot dead, and she played a part in doing that. She shares that she originally went there to be the accomplice, make sure to help, but she openly, I have to say, I love Terry. I love Terry. I don't, again, condone the heartbreak and every behind the scenes. I don't condone that. But I've known her for 18 years now, and she has remorse. She loves to talk. She has a nature that's very gentle, but she'll call a spade a spade. She'll call me out at times. It's a wonderful engagement. Her experience, and she talks a lot about when I write about her, is that what it was like for her all those years ago. She was an African-American woman, but she was also a law enforcement officer. Okay, and that's not looked upon, graciously at all. If you're a law enforcement officer and you kill someone. So she talks a little bit about the hardship and the navigation of, I'm African-American and I was a police officer. Usually it's me putting these women away. And then she talks also about turning to her faith, being a Muslim woman, and how that's given her a path. It's amazing. She is so funny and she's so loud and vivacious, yet she's so gentle. And she, again, is a wonderful mentor. See, I go back to the women that are serving the long-to-life sentences or life without parole. She had a second-degree murder charge, and she's serving life without parole.
Is she? So she's never getting out?
She's never getting out. Terry has come before the Board of Parole and Probation twice, I think now, for commutation, and has been denied. And you can come up for commutation in Pennsylvania, I believe, for 3 times, but you have to have so many years in between. She was gutted. Again, she has gone through and attended, like many of the women, if there's a chance to be paroled or commuted. There are programs, that they have to attend over the years. But these are women that have been there, 20, 30 years. It's like we've been there, done all that. Now we're just biding our time.
I want to move on to Jamie. Jamie Silverneck was found guilty of killing her mother when she was 14. 14.
Yes, 14.
The prosecution said she was the mastermind behind the plot, and it was her then 20-year-old boyfriend who stabbed her mother. There's a few interesting things about her story. One, she wasn't tried as a juvenile. That was in an adult court. How did that even happen?
Okay. Well, in the United States, you can be as young as 11 years old in some states and be tried as an adult if it's deemed a first-degree murder charge. And Jamie was a co-accomplice, and she also acknowledges she did participate beyond the texting, and beyond the narrative back and forth with her co-accomplice. So Jamie has received 35 years. That's literally a norm. If you are, shall we say, if you're a juvenile and you're charged as an adult, you can serve up to the 35 years before you will then be released. Jamie's case, and I'll touch a little bit more on the crime. She talks about the remorse that she has because she has a brother and a father still surviving, and she took the life of her mother. And she talks, and these are her words, not mine, because I don't wish at all to sensationalise, but she talks about how unexpectedly she still has the love and support of her family, considering she took something so valuable from them.
Because it was a vicious murder.
It was a vicious murder. There was strangulation, there was bashing, and then the burial of her mother.
How have you found the conversations with her? What was meeting her like? Because she would have been quite young still when you met her.
So Jamie was 14, just after 14 when she she entered the prison system. She went to county jail for a very short time because you always will go to county jail. As I said before, it's a bit like remand here. Anyway, so when she talks about, I asked her, I said, well, it's challenging for her to have to go back and think, well, what was I thinking at 14, 15, right? And she's early 20s now. But she reminds me it was all a blur. There was guilt, there was confusion, and she said an isolation in a county jail. Now, it's a county jail for women. It's not a detention centre by any means. It's a county jail. But, of course, you are separated because you are a juvenile from, again, the general, we'll say, population there. To her, it was just a blur, guilt, crime, depression, no doubt, is my life worth it? You know what I mean? But she was young, 14, going not quite 15. So by the time she's turning 15, she then goes upstate, which is SCI Muncie again. So within a 12-month period, someone had mentioned, have you heard about Dr. Kate or Dr. Whiteley? They usually call me Dr. Kate. Here I go again. Have you heard about her? And it was so lovely. Her father had heard about me as a visitor and the work I do. And again, one of many parents concerned about his daughter. So I reached out to her via her father. So then I would visit her and the conversations we'd have about how she was adjusting to upstate. Now, there were several years that she was in an isolated, shall we say, housing, and which meant that she could not move about in general population. She had to have someone with her 24/7, which you can understand. She's 14, 15.
But it also means quite a lonely existence.
It was. Now that she's in general population all these years later, she's really excelled from an educational perspective because she certainly does have high IQ. But talking to her about the navigation of when she first entered the state prison, she said, literally it was all like a blur, but she was depressed, a lot of remorse.
We're kind of talking about the crimes of these women and then not positives, but how they've managed to turn their lives around. But it can't all be, roses. We know enough about prison to know there's a lot of bad stuff that happens in there. There's a high concentration of dangerous women as well.
Yes.
The women you've spoken to, have they experienced violence, sexual abuse, the damages and the bad side of prison?
All of them have at one stage or another, but the longer the women are inside, the less, and most of them talk about this, the less they are at condemning their experience of the prison system, because a lot of reflection has gone on. And there are fights, absolutely. There are fights, there is abuse, certainly, and it's not necessarily from the officers, but it can be from the women. I'm not sugarcoating anything here, but the women that I talked to, some of them were the abusers, but I don't necessarily go down that path unless they wish to talk about that. Yeah, absolutely.
Have you spoken to many women on death row, and how are their experiences different to those that are going to die in prison anyway with life?
It's interesting because, like what you're referring to here, is you have women that are serving life without parole, and there are usually all of them in general population now. And then you have the women that were on death row, and I'll talk about the women on death row in Pennsylvania. So I have conversations with 3 women that were on death row. They talk about the comparison of death row, their experience, the day-to-day, and then they talk about now, because they all appealed and won their appeal, they're serving life without parole. And it's a bit like the life without parole is their freedom. It's amazing when you hear their stories. Yeah.
They still see it like that, even though they know they're going to die behind bars.
Absolutely. They still, again, they don't want to die there, and I want to make that very clear. And if they could leave tomorrow, they would. And there's always hope that something will change. Each woman talks about that. Now, each of the women have killed, one has killed a child, one has killed an elderly man, another has killed a woman. So it's serious. They have taken someone else's life, a loved one's life. So, it's amazing. But they do talk about the comparisons of what it was like there and now in general population.
Because you are segregated if you're on death row.
Well, they are separated in a different wing. And even in Texas, in Mountain View unit, where I went there to do research, the death row wing is separated. And protocol is that if a woman from death row is being moved, or any of the prisons over there, everything goes into lockdown. So that person can go from A to B if it's medical, something like that. But they are separated. But the women in Pennsylvania do talk about how they had an hour a day and what they did. So, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Are there any other cases or women's stories that stand out to you?
There is one young woman I'd like to talk about, and her name is Jessica. She was incarcerated at 16 in Pennsylvania as an adult, tried as an adult. She grew up not knowing who her mother was. Her grandparents raised her. However, she found out in her early teens that her mother lived just down the road, and not knowing that. So she was raised with her aunts and uncles. She's very bright, but she said she always had the challenge of trying to understand, where do I fit in? I just don't feel, this doesn't feel normal as a teenager. It just doesn't feel right in the home environment. And yet she loved her grandparents. Anyway, she used to hang out with a group, and they called themselves the Misfits. So there was, someone in their early 20s, late teens, and a couple others around the 15, 16-year-olds. So they'd go out and drink a little bit of drugs and party and wherever, and, somewhere in the country. And what happened to Jessica is that she was involved then, this one particular time, she was involved with the murder of a young 14, 15-year-old girl. This young girl, tragically was beaten. They tried to hang her. That was unsuccessful. And then, tragically, the participation by Jessica was that she also took part by bludgeoning the young girl to death. So this is Jessica. And I'm just trying to paint it, not to be gory or whichever. I want to paint the picture of her path. So Jessica is one of the few that would probably say, well, she acknowledges, and she's very intelligent. She acknowledges she participated, but won't acknowledge to the extreme of her participation. Now, Jessica has been in the system for 20-something years, and she will be serving at least 35 years, in her early 50s when she's released in Pennsylvania. Jessica will talk about how she doesn't even know what a credit card is. She never drove a car, doesn't know what a cell phone or a mobile phone is, has no idea. And she talks in the podcast about growing up as a teenager in a women's maximum security prison. And it's her conversation's amazing because there are things that we all take for granted. And so her youth literally was growing up around other women in a prison, a state prison.
I want to talk briefly about media coverage. How did the women you spoke to feel about the way they were written about and spoken about in the media?
Well, the older women, we're going back years ago, weren't that privy because it was like television or hard copy newspaper, right? So you've got a difference of storytelling here. Some will say that they were always made out to be, or she's smiling, or look at her, she's not showing remorse. So the perception is that media don't tell the whole story, or there are too many people that are experts in the field. And I'll give you an example. One of the women, she talks about how she was walking into the courts in Pennsylvania, walking in, and her grandmother was making a joke or trying to lessen the pain, knowing that she's going in there, she may not come out after sentencing. And she said, she talks a bit about how the media took that one photo of her smiling and laughing, how she was going into the courts. And she said that was everywhere, cold-hearted woman, there are terminologies, as I said, I won't say on here, but there were words that they used or phrases, monstrous, demonic, bad, sick woman, but more evil, the monstrous evil narrative is what they use. From her smiling, she said, I really can't even recall what I was laughing about. And it certainly wasn't that I'm laughing that I'm going to be sentenced now possibly to life or life without parole. The older women, the little that they were privy to, saddens them because they believed that they were showcased. There was a good photo or something and a headline. That's what sold their story. Now, the younger women, they're with social media, they're more exposed now because of the social media coming through. And Jamie talks a little bit about, about the media and how the phrasing around the young killer or all I'm saying is that there is a difference to what either woman, the older women or the older generation and the newer were privy to, because they find out now from families and friends what's going on.
But I would argue that some of what these women did is evil. It is monstrous.
Oh, absolutely. Yes,
so why can't the media use those words to describe them?
Well, this is what the women say. They don't believe that. They don't believe because of a choice they made.
Right.
They don't believe. And it's interesting because some of the women will say, we made one mistake. Now, I'm using their words.
Yes.
I'm not justifying by any means. But they will say it was a one mistake or it was a one-off. And they don't believe, for many of them, they do not believe that they should have been glorified. It's not really glorified, but, sensationalized with that particular, shall we say, stereotype.
It's definitely interesting to hear that perspective. I do see both sides.
Oh, absolutely. Again, because I'm passionate about working with these women, or again, giving them a platform to have a voice. There are women that I sit beside and I sometimes think, I just really have a great time with you. I really enjoy working with you. And, our friendship will go on for years. But would I want you to be released tomorrow and sit next to me or live next to me, in my home? Possibly not. You know what I mean?
Really? Because I have wondered that. How do you call these women friends knowing what they've done?
I'm not looking at what they've done. They're inside now. That has happened. They're being punished. I wouldn't be doing the work that I do if I was purely focused on the punishment and the crime that they did. And I think, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, that's why what I do is unique. Because I am not focusing and I mean, we all judge. It's easy to say I don't judge. I'm sure, well, I certainly do. I may have my own thoughts. But it's so easy to focus on the crime and criminality and then get carried away with that and the sensationalism of that. And they're being punished. And they'll tell me, we made a mistake. We are being punished. We are serving. Again, we're talking about life and life without parole. Okay, so not 10 years, 15 years or 5 years and we're out. I just think it's a very important journey that they have the opportunity. But again, Can I say this? It could be, what it is that it could be any, and I get passionate about this, so often we think it can't be our aunt, our mother, or our sister. And then, in the United States, I talk to my students, my university students or college students, and I talk particularly to the females, and I think, well, you're driving in a car, you're using your phone, you career off the road, you kill someone. Now, in the United States, it's called vehicular homicide. You can get 8 years, 12 years, 14 years. And you're deemed someone that's murdered someone or killed someone.
But that is a very different crime to Jamie,
yes,
who texted her boyfriend and plotted to kill her mother.
At the end of the day, it's a different crime, but someone has lost their life.
Yeah.
And that's how I look at that.
Right.
We have a great discussion here. But on that note, I want to share, could I share just an example of a woman that suffered from postpartum psychosis, and I got to know her. Her name was Meg, and it was in Lancaster in the United States in Pennsylvania, and she'd killed her 2 little boys, and she was sentenced to death. But through her court proceedings, there was a problem in the very beginning of her sentencing. So she was released after 4 years. Now, I became very close to Meg, or Megan, and she always wanted me to share her story. So she had killed her little 12-month-old baby, and then I think it was like almost her 2, nearly 3-year-old son, and she had drowned both of her little boys. But she had said if I had had help or sought help earlier on in my life, that possibly no matter how much and what I did with my two boys and inflict such pain, it may not have happened. She suffered from postpartum psychosis. So that's another story. But I met her. The tragic ending is she took her own life. Months and months later, I never heard from her, and they found her in a southern state in the United States. But once she was released, she used to talk about her beautiful boys. Remorse, absolutely. And she was trying to better herself. I even had her come in and talk to my students in one of the universities I worked at. And I just set the premise that this woman has committed murder, and you have the right to sit here and listen, or you have the right to go. And I would say only one student got up and walked away. And it was I'm just trying to point, it was an amazing moment for her to share her story about what happened to her, what was she going through when she had committed this horrendous crime to her two sons. It was amazing.
Not talking about Meg specifically, but thinking about all the stories of these women, I feel like we often try and find the reason behind why they did it. It can't be that they're just bad or evil.
Do you know, it's interesting we say that, but maybe at the very beginning, I'm not sure if I mentioned, there is a small cohort of women that are bad. And if I didn't mention it, I'm going to go out and say it. There is certainly a small cohort of women that will behave and act just the same as men, that they are bad, that they are evil, and it's by choice, not any psychological rationale. And that's something, and I may not have said it, but we have a tendency over the years, and we still continue to do it, to pathologise women, to give them the excuse that they were mad as opposed to bad, as opposed to some of them being just downright evil. You know what I mean? And we can be evil, we can be bad. We don't need, shall we say, the pathologisation to justify, or, you know, it shouldn't always justify why we committed the crime. Now I do have a very few women that'll say, if I had to do it again, and I'm not talking about children, I'm talking about a partner or something like that, if I had to do it again, I'd do it all over again. So there is, but no, I will certainly say there is a cohort of women, a group of women that do choose to be bad, that are evil. I mean, I can't get my head around what really evil means in that context. But there are some women that certainly are, and I've come across them.
And I am playing devil's advocate here, because when you do look at the male cohort, I mean, a lot of the crimes that you see, men, serial killers, rape, murder, like all of these vicious crimes, like they are evil. But I guess we can't just let women get away with.
Well, we can't. And I'm not here to do that either, as you know, with the work. I've met and interviewed Sylvia Segrist, a mass shooter from Philadelphia going back in the 80s. Now, she's one of the few mass killers, shall we say, of females in the United States. But Sylvia was diagnosed at the age of 14 before she committed the crime at a shopping centre just outside of Philadelphia in the 80s. She was at the age of 14 diagnosed with a mental illness. So she is still in SCI Muncie, and she's always separated because she could harm others as well. I met with her. I actually interviewed her. Amazing. I had no control of that interview because I didn't know I had no control. So she took over the interview because of her diagnosis. Like, she has bipolar and she's schizophrenic as well. And anyway, I won't get into that, but that was what was happening with our interview. But there's a case, yes, as a mass shooter, society, family, friends, we didn't look after her because people lost their lives because she should have been, well, she was in and out, but she should have stayed within a mental institution there.
Are there any other big differences that you've noticed? I know you focus on the women, but between the male and female prisoners?
The crime itself.
Right.
The infliction of, the violence or the actual crime or the behaviour they have. A lot of the women, we know this generally speaking, and it's in research that women will usually offend someone close to them, and particularly if it's a mother or a child, etc., or a loved one, sometimes also in self-defence. But we also then know that males, many of the men that, again, in the United States especially, they're in there because they've, committed a crime. It's been drugs and or alcohol, robbery, murder, for usually acquaintance or a friend like that. So the differences are that, again, women commit usually violent crimes to someone that's close or someone they know as opposed to a stranger. And, again, that's the difference between the males and the females, and I'm only generalising here.
It's interesting you say that, though, because when I think of male offending, I think about the fact that one woman a week dies at the hands of a former or current partner in Australia. But you're saying that because there's so many more men that the actual statistics show that they're actually killing a lot of other people as well.
Absolutely. I'm glad and it was great how you framed that, because I don't want to sound like that, men don't kill, intimate partner violence, or I don't want it to be seen that I'm saying that men don't kill intimates like women, like as you just mentioned here in Australia and also in other countries. But if you look on the average, the bigger picture to the men, say, that are incarcerated for violent crimes, say in the United States, an example, you'll find, it could be 60-40, but often it's more someone they know, an acquaintance, and that could also be a partner, but often it's, again, I'll say this, drug bust, money, trafficking, human sex trafficking, these type of, shall we say, realms of criminality, as opposed to the women.
And you would say that a stranger murder is very uncommon with women, but more likely with men?
It's more likely, a stranger acquaintance is more likely with men. With women, no, it's usually someone very close to them as opposed to a stranger.
Thanks to Dr. Kathryn M. Whiteley for helping us to tell these stories. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast, hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tahli Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.